Hello and welcome to Session 2 course overview for English 104A Research Writing with your instructor, Mrs. Barker. The items we're looking at this week are all about finding and evaluating sources. We want to understand how to create and construct a balanced and preliminary thesis statement. We want to evaluate academic and sometimes non-academic sources. We want to identify differences between primary and secondary, and we want to start analyzing. I want you to notice words like preliminary. We're going to be doing drafts. We're going to be doing numerous renditions of our different assignments here. So I want you to think about what you're doing not as a final product and not as being graded as a final product, but rather as part of a dialogue, a conversation between you and I to reach the best possible outcome. There are three major assignments this week: analyzing resources, which is our discussion thread, turning in your first draft of your research paper, and looking at a plagiarism quiz. I'm going to leave that one for you to explore on our course shell because there are links to useful ideas and you can take the quiz twice. I wanted to show our reading assignment list for this week. Not only do you have a couple of chapters in the book, but there are also lots of items in the course shell. So I want you to take the time to look at that book and to see different explanations and explorations that they have. I'm going to cite a couple of pages in this particular PowerPoint. I want you to look at things like page 6 and page 25 when we look at things like writing a thesis. So analyzing resources. This is a long list. We give you a resource worksheet. We give you an evaluating resources checklist. We ask you to look at things like surprising elements in the checklist and looking at secondary and primary resources. The element I want to look at on this slide is the last one. What's that difference? What makes one resource different from another? When we're looking at elements like that, we need to think about who is present to create the original resource and who is responding to that resource. So if I write a book, I am the primary resource. I am the person most connected to that work because it is something I have created. More often than not, though, I'm writing about a book someone else has written. That makes me a secondary source. What happens, though, if I read a book, I write about it, and then you read what I wrote? That makes your response a tertiary response. So more often than not, we are much further removed from the original work and the primary source than we would have ever contemplated. So as you look at items, consider who the original creator is and look at all of the people between you and the original work. So for instance, let's say you're reading the Bible. You're reading Mark. You're reading that and you are exploring it. Well, you not only have the fact that you're reading a translation, but you have all of these other different elements between you and the original. So think about the original person who wrote it, and that being our primary resource, and then the translator and the editor coming between you and that person. So there are at least a handful of people having a discussion about what you see on the page before it gets to you. So more often than not, look for the pieces, the steps that remove you. The two ideas I'm going to stress for our worksheets and our templates are toolbox ideas. We're going to give you lots of items for your toolbox, but we don't necessarily need you to use them for absolutely everything. So I want to point out a couple of elements that you can use more often than not. The rest of it, I want you to explore. I want you to think about it each time and see what helps with that particular resource. Consider the idea of a thesis. This is a wonderful opportunity to start to say, well, what is a thesis? What is the author sharing? Because the more you read, the better you're going to get at writing. You're going to be more comfortable with how people put things together. So look for that writer's thesis. Look for that writer's main points. This doesn't have to be a series of sentences. It can be 3 words that sum up the main paper concepts. The next idea, look for the location. That's our yellow arrow. Time happens. Space and time get between us and what we originally found. So make sure that you can always leave enough clues, enough breadcrumbs, so that you can find where that originally was. locations on the web change, so we want to know who the author is, we want to know an original publication date, we want to look for all those numbers and try to do our best to fill that out now, just in case it moves around later. The next example is our evaluating resources checklist. I wanted to stop by just a couple of elements. I want you to look at the domain name for authority. We want to know who is creating and maintaining a website. Endings on websites, things like .edu, that tells us it's an educational website. .gov is going to tell us it's a government site. Different countries use different examples, so .com would be commercial, .co.uk would be country, CO, and .uk would be the United Kingdom. So look for those elements because you need to know where it's coming from. That will explain different elements about language and different ways that people gather information. So look for those ideas. Also look for something like ours, which would be www.ccu.edu. That will let us know that it's Colorado Christian University and it's an educational domain. Look for those elements because it's going to help. A great example of how to watch for this is when you get a phishing email. It's when someone says, oh my goodness, you need to go to this link and type in your Apple password. Well, when you click on it, instead of saying .apple.com, it may say something like .heaven.apples.grapefruits.com. And that's a good indicator that it is not the website you thought it was. So look for those domain names. This is an interesting point too about links. I like to start with sites like Wikipedia. I don't stop there, but I start there. And they have lots of great links to redirect me to all sorts of great information. So look for a website that is sharing links, that's sharing connections. If they don't share those, are they sharing references? Where did they get the information that they have? Why do they have that information? So for instance, something like the American Heart Association. They are creating content because they have a huge number of doctors on their board and a huge number of specialists. That's great. They don't necessarily need to link elsewhere. Look for those elements. Ask questions. Finally, another example I wanted to take from this, although there are lots of different ideas, walk through this and see what you can get. Where is it from? Where's the documentation? Is the person being open about who they are and their credentials? If I'm giving you lots of information about writing, I should know something about writing. I should have maybe lots of experience, maybe lots of education. I should have something to back that up for you to listen to me. And in my case, I share that with you for our bio when we're starting out our course because I want you to know where that information is coming from and why you should listen to it. So do that when you are reading. This is a great way to spot really poor websites. They will hide. They won't share who they are. The important thing to consider for the research paper is that it's a draft. We're going to keep writing this. We're going to write 2 more drafts and we're going to turn in our final product in session 4. I expect mistakes and errors. I expect discussion. I want you to utilize resources in this unit, and I want you to build on your outline from session 1. I want you to take our discussion from this unit and apply it to the next session. That's the building scheme that we have going on here. We're writing a research paper. That's hugely different than a report. So why am I being so fussy, saying that research and paper are 2 very different things than a report? What on earth does that mean? Research. I really want you to have at least half, if not 2/3, of your resources from the library. I want you to be evaluating professional academic resources. I want you to discover that world and I want you to utilize that world. So I'm going to keep pushing you to do that. If you have any struggles with it, remember, reach out and make me help you. A paper. A paper can be really different. I think it's difficult at this stage because we don't necessarily walk through these ideas with you. When you first start to learn, we make you write reports because we want you to look for information. You're not ready to process it. But that was a long time ago. It was a long time ago that you just needed to gather information. Now we want you to process it. We want you to take those next steps to say what is good or bad, what is right or wrong, what makes sense and doesn't make sense, what should I believe? And that's where a paper comes in. So Lester and Lester on page 6, start to explore the idea of what different kinds of assignments are going to require. Look at this idea, literature, history, and the fine arts. Those have a different requirement, a different need. They need things like evaluation, interpretation. Those are different than education and psychology, which may want definitions or comparisons or analysis. The sciences want something else. They want you to discuss the implications of your findings. All of these different ideas are going to come out as you start to explore. But the main takeaway I want you to have is that you are no longer simply gathering information. You are making decisions. You are deciding what is useful, what is not useful. You are essentially judging that work. You're critiquing it. You're saying what works and what doesn't. You're gathering numerous different viewpoints and you're putting them into one cohesive paper. The other most important topic for our last 2 slides is the idea of a thesis. So I tend to put these 3 concepts under one big blanket, calling it a thesis. So check out page 25 of Lester and Lester, because they talk about them as a thesis, an enthymeme, and a hypothesis. They talk about a thesis advancing a conclusion you defend. They talk about an enthymeme using a because clause. I love using because. I feel like it makes that first statement and then because, and that leads to my process for how I got where I am. A hypothesis, you have to test that theory. So more often than not, I put forth a hypothesis of what the author intends or what a character is supposed to mean in literature when I'm writing about it, and then I have to explain that to my readers. So look through these examples and see what makes sense to you. I often encourage everyone to use a superlative. I love using comparative adjectives to make my thesis simple. So some examples: the best, the most important, the least important, the least useful. Words, the strongest, the oldest, the newest. So here's an example of how to get a basic thesis going. You could say something like the most important 3 reasons. That sets up your process for whatever you're going to discuss are X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z being your processes, your 3 main points. So as you go through evaluating the resources you have gathered, consider what their thesis looks like. Does it have something like this? Which of these 3 examples would that thesis fall under? Is it truly a thesis? Is it an enthymeme? Is it a hypothesis? Are they using things like superlatives? How are they setting up their process? Ask those questions of what you read, because writers are sharing those ideas with you to help you the same way you, as a writer, are sharing those ideas to help me, your reader. It's a full circle example of what's happening when you write. So I hope you have fun this week as you explore your first draft. And as always, if you have questions, make sure you ask.